That January, Pat was fighting extradition in Alabama. Watson was ordered to California, then granted a 30-day continuance. Leslie requested that Ira Reiner replace her current attorney. Linda was arraigned and pled not guilty. Diane Lake was admitted that month to Patton State Hospital, diagnosed as schizophrenic. She recalled, "Jack Gardner, the cop who'd been my arresting officer, must have seen something in me worth saving, because when I was institutionalized, he began visiting me there. When it was time for me to be released, he and his wife took me in as a foster child. They were the first people who helped me feel safe enough to speak about what I'd been through, what I'd seen and heard. I lived securely with them until I testified." After being introduced to acid at age 13 by her own father and abandoned to live with the abusive Manson family, Diane finally found someone who would protect her. On January 19th, the family was shocked to see none other than activist Abby Hoffman at Spahn Ranch. Abby and his wife visited the family, now labeled counterculture heroes. That month, Manson appeared on the cover of Tuesday's Child magazine, hailed as Man of the Year. The hero worship didn't last long, but for a few brief months in early 1970, Charlie and the family were celebrated by some on the radical left. Charlie met daily with followers who passed on his messages to those he needed to set straight or bring back to the fold. The prosecution knew that their ace in the hole, aka Sadie Mae Glutz, was teetering on the edge. As Bugliosi wrote, "At any moment, Susan could insist on seeing Charlie, and Caballero would be unable to prevent it. After Susan's story had appeared in the Los Angeles Times, little signs had appeared on the walls at Sybil Brand, reading, 'Sadie Glutz is a snitch.' This greatly upset Susan, and each time something like this happened, the scales seemed to tip a little more in Manson's favor." On February 6th, Leslie was legally ruled sane and granted her requested change of attorney. Judge Keene rescheduled the start of the trial for March 30th. On the 16th, Manson requested a change of venue, claiming he couldn't get a fair shake in the City of Angels. Judge Keene denied his request. Finally, Patricia waived extradition and returned to California. Her first court appearance was February 24th. That day, Bruce was arrested in Bakersfield using a false ID to buy weapons. Susan's visitors were making headway with her. She requested a meeting with Manson, granted 2 weeks later, but the request signaled the prosecutorial team that she was going to flip. But on February 26th, the case against Manson got a boon when Linda was cut a deal for immunity. Kasabian's attorney, Gary Fleischman, said, "Linda had seen them committing mayhem at the Tate House. She had driven the killers to the La Bianca residence, but she hadn't done anything. Still, she was technically guilty of first-degree murder. I told her that a deal was the only way out. She initially didn't want to do that. These were her soulmates, no matter what they'd done. But I told her, 'You're broke, you're pregnant, and you were there. You must become a prosecution witness.' One day, Aaron Stovitz, the head of the trial division, called me. He said, 'I want to talk to you.' I said, 'I'm going to get my hair cut at the barber shop at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Come on over.' So he drives out, and he makes me an offer. A very strange confluence of events had occurred. They needed Linda Kasabian, and she needed them. They gave her total immunity. Bugliosi was initially hesitant about Kasabian's offer. He was still banking on Susan. "It's bad enough that we had to give Susan Atkins something. If we give deals to Atkins and Kasabian, who are we going to prosecute for the 5 Tate killings? Just Charlie? The people of this city won't tolerate that. They're shocked and outraged by these crimes. Drive through Bel Air sometime. The fear is still so real you can feel it." But Kasabian's attorney made a compelling case for his client. Bugliosi wrote, "According to Fleischman, Linda was anxious to testify. He had urged her to fight extradition. She'd gone against his advice and come back to California because she wanted to tell the whole story." Okay, what can she testify to? According to Susan, Linda never entered either the Tate or La Bianca residences. As far as we know, She wasn't an eyewitness to any of the murders, with the possible exception of Stephen Parent. More important, as long as we have Susan, Linda's testimony would be valueless to us, since Susan and Linda are both accomplices. As you well know, the law is clear on this. The testimony of one accomplice can't be used to corroborate the testimony of another accomplice. In a sense, it didn't matter who ended up as our star witness. Without corroboration, our case would be lost as a matter of law. We not only had to find corroboration against each of the defendants, that corroborating evidence had to be completely independent of the accomplice's testimony. Aaron had seen Linda briefly when she was booked into Civil Brand. I'd never seen her. For all I knew, she was probably just as freaky as Sadie Mae Glutz. Now, if Susan bolts back to Charlie, I told Aaron, and we're left without a major witness for the trial, as well we might be, then we can talk about a deal for Linda. In fact, if that happens, Linda may be our only hope. The prosecution sat down for their first meeting with Linda on February 28th. Bugliosi was impressed with the little hippie girl, as he referred to her for the rest of his life. She was heavily pregnant that day and emotional, often weeping as she described what she witnessed on August 9th and 10th. From the first interview, I believed her story, the prosecutor wrote in Helter Skelter, and I felt that a jury would also. There were no pauses in her answers, no evasions, no attempts to make herself appear something she was not. She was brutally frank. When a witness takes the stand and tells the truth, even though it is injurious to his own image, you know he can't be impeached. I knew that if Linda testified truthfully about those 2 nights of murder, it would be immaterial whether she had been promiscuous, taken dope, stolen. The question was, could the defense attack her credibility regarding the events of those 2 nights? And I knew the answer from our very first interview. They wouldn't be able to do so because she was so obviously telling the truth. On February 11th, Kitty gave birth to a daughter named Jeannie. She also returned to the family. New followers that spring included 21-year-old Jennifer Leghorn, a.k.a. Jeannie Gentry. Slim, with blonde hair, Jeannie was among those filmed the next summer by Robert Hendrickson for the documentary Manson. In February, Jeannie snuck into the courthouse while Bruce was at a hearing and passed him a tab of acid. Jeannie was arrested, but never tried. On March 5th, Sadie and Charlie met in jail. As she later wrote, Caballero did everything he could to talk me out of it, but failed. Nearly 5 months after entering Civil Brand, I was taken to the Los Angeles County Jail to see him. Sitting opposite me at a table in the big visiting room with a large divider between us, Charlie looked pretty much as he had. He had a beard and shoulder-length hair and was dressed in jailhouse blues. He was friendly but hard as steel just beneath the surface. I was frightened. With Caballero sitting to my right and a deputy sheriff with him, Charlie looked at me with his piercing eyes early in the conversation. Sadie, are you afraid of the gas chamber? I knew he was pressing me as to why I had talked. No, I'm not afraid of it now, I said, smiling. In that instant, I was back under his control. He also ordered her to fire Caballero, and sure enough, she sent word to the judge immediately after her conversation with Manson, requesting new counsel. Sergeant McCann was incensed to hear that the star witness was under her guru's sway again. Manson and Susan Atkins started communicating, and she completely changed. She became very belligerent. She didn't want anything more to do with us. She decided she wouldn't testify. But Susan knew what was at stake. She witnessed the way Charlie used children to strong-arm their mothers. When Linda Kasabian wanted to leave Spahn Ranch after the Cielo and La Bianca murders, her daughter was moved to a place where she could be guarded by armed thugs. This is the same type of persuasion which helped contribute to my decision to recant my grand jury testimony and confess that Charles Manson had nothing to do with the murders. Charles Manson sent his followers to suggest that it might be better for me and my son if I decided not to testify against him. In the end, I succumbed. But I have to point out the position I was in was not a very nice one. I was being promised by Manson that if I didn't do what he told me to, I wouldn't live a year in prison, and possibly my son would be harmed as well. On the other side, I was being promised by the prosecutor that if I didn't do what he told me to, I would be executed. In the end, it became very clear. I'd seen what Charles Manson was capable of doing, even to friends like Gary Hinman, and I knew he'd never considered me a friend. Or, as Bugliosi put it, Sadie went back to her god, Charlie. In hindsight, I've come to believe this is exactly what the prosecution wanted. Atkins wrote, "It was obvious the district attorney would rather have made a deal with Linda from the start. They knew they weren't going to be able to prosecute her anyway. If I could be induced to recant my testimony, and therefore invalidate my deal, what I'd said to the women in county jail could be used as corroborating evidence for anything Linda said against me." Susan also reminded us that the DA knew she had been receiving visits from the family. They knew she wasn't protected. The moment that Manson and the other defendants learned that Linda would testify against them, a systemic campaign to impugn the woman began. Manson was granted the right to represent himself in December, but on March 6th, Judge Keene vacated that right. He appointed defender Charles Holopeter to represent Charlie. Holopeter didn't last long, however. That day, the album Lie was released. Composed of songs recorded before the murders, it was hastily put together by Phil Kaufman, Manson's jailhouse buddy. Immediately after, an attorney representing Wojtek Frykowski's son filed a garnishment order against royalties for the album's sales. On March 7th, Linda delivered a baby boy named Angel. And in March, Ruth Ann became pregnant. Even pregnant, little Oish was still waiting to get her first pig, and she nearly got the chance just a few months later.